Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which is part of a series called Intimate Archives, which is coming to you, sounds so cheesy, from the University in Johannesburg. It's hosted by a project called Governing Intimacies, which I lead. My name is Srila Roy, and I'm an associate professor at Wits University. The series is co-curated by myself and Kayo Arusho, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at Wits, WISER. And basically, if you've been following along, you know that we've been trying to do, I suppose, two things. We've been trying to showcase some new work in the field of sexuality studies, gender studies, quite broadly, on and from the African continent. And we've also been trying to, tap into what we think is really interesting about this concept of the archive, but thinking about it quite capaciously. And I feel like this session has been long overdue, Kyle, don't you think? Because in a way, it's looking at queer representation in a whole range of media, whether that's cinematic, literary, memoir. There is this, I think there's a palpable boom in cultural production, but also the question of obviously representation, identity has been so pervasive to everything we've been talking about. So I feel like it's kind of been in the background. And so I'm just so excited that today we're actually really going to talk about it. And we have three incredible speakers with us. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will speak. And actually, it's really heartwarming because in very different ways, they've also been part of the larger life of governing intimacies. And I'm very grateful to each and one of them. So I will introduce them in the order at which they will speak. The first two speakers will speak for no more than 15 minutes, and then our lovely discussant will respond for no more than 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to you. And I'll just tell you at the end how we'll do the Q&A. Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who's Gibson Kube, who's currently an associate professor in the Department of Languages, Literature and Culture at the University of Zimbabwe. He's also an Iso Lomso Fellow at STIAS in Stellenbosch and the 2021 Mary Kingsley Sokonis Distinguished Lecturer for the African Studies Association, UK. He's on a number of boards, including, obviously I have to mention this, our very own Governing Intimacies in the Global South book series from Manchester University Press. And Gibson is also working on a monograph on queer bodies in Southern Africa, which I think broadly we'll hear a little bit about today. So welcome, Gibson. It's actually been such a pleasure to have you in all of our conversations. You've been such a trooper. Thank you so much. Okay, our second speaker, I think, doesn't need much of an introduction to those of us who are here in Johannesburg and indeed in South Africa. Jamil Khan is a critical diversity scholar, columnist, and author, also doing a PhD in critical diversity studies here at WITS. They are the author of the incredibly successful sociopolitical memoir called Khamr. Oh, I butchered that one. The Makings of Waterslams, which was the winner of the best biography at the 2021 Humanities and Social Sciences Award. Jameel also has a very powerful contribution to a book that I'm co-editing with two colleagues on the Me Too movement in India and South Africa, which is coming out next year. I'm very excited for that poignant piece to be in the world. And Jameel, I just want to say thank you for all the social justice crusading you do. I see maybe only a sliver of it on Twitter, but I think it takes a great deal of resilience. So thank you for that, over and above everything else. And finally, Dee Markle is a lecturer here at the Department of Media Studies at WITS. Dee holds a PhD from the Department of Film and Television Studies at Warwick University. And her research to date has looked at apartheid and post-apartheid as a project of memory and cultural practices, primarily through cinema, but also other kinds of cultural work. And Dee is embarking on very new and exciting work on motherhood, maternal practices, a project that actually I'm really interested in seeing how that develops. Okay, so welcome to all three of you. Before I hand over to Gibson, as I said, the way we do our Q&A, well, actually, you can put in your questions in the chat, you can use the Q&A function, and Kayo will just gather them for us and present them to the speakers. So great, Gibson, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Srila. I'm so excited to be taking part in this webinar, and I'm so grateful to the organizers of this Intimate Archives webinar series. So this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about queer representation in African films. So my previous research has focused on queer representation in African literary texts, mainly from North Africa. And in the presentation that I'm going to give this afternoon, I wish to talk about one of my most recent areas of focus, which is African films. So offering a very exhaustive analysis of queer representation in African films in just 15 minutes is very impossible, I think. So what I'll try to do is to just look at 4 films, which I think are representative of contemporary queer representation in African cultural imagining. And the 4 films are Salvation Army by the Moroccan writer and filmmaker Abdel Attaya, the South African film Ingleba, The Wound, directed by John Trenkov, the Nollywood film Hell in High Water by Asuf Oluseyi, and then finally Rafiki by Kenyan filmmaker Wanuri Kahui. So these touchstone films in their respective traditions and temperaments speak to larger present day concerns and display wider preoccupations in queer representation in Africa. So I'll just quickly start with the first film, Salvation Army, which was released in 2014. In this film, it's about the coming of age of the protagonist named Abdella, who has to negotiate his sexuality within a very unaccommodating society of Morocco. In this film, the filmmaker strips down sound and dialogue to the very barest minimum. What dominates the film are echoing silences in which viewers have to read what the bodies are doing on the screen. And the silent soundscape and the landscape in which the protagonist finds himself in are quite enabling forces which make it possible for him to relate not just to himself and his body and his sexuality, but also to others. The fact that Abdella, the protagonist, says very little throughout this film speaks to how silence itself is a language and how it's possible to read into and beyond the silence. So the vocal muting of the protagonist, coupled with the silence that pervades the social space, are important and are compelling, or they compel the viewer to focus on the protagonist and how he navigates his body and the different spaces that he inhabits. So Salvation Army, in its representation of queerness, plays an important role in giving visibility to marginalized gender and sexual identities in Arab Muslim countries of North Africa like Morocco. And the second film is called Ingleba, The Wound, and was released in 2016. Ingleba is a drama film that has received international acclaim. And the film was rather met with violent demonstrations in South Africa, specifically because of the way in which it tried to portray Ulwalu, or the traditional initiation rituals of the Xhosa of South Africa. So the demonstrations were mainly by Xhosa men who felt that the film infringed on their culture. Ingleba is very central to discourses on sexualities as it deals with diverse facets of Black masculinity in contemporary South Africa. The framing of manhood and masculinity in this film is mainly within the traditional space of the mountain where the initiation ceremonies take place. The film focuses on three main protagonists, Kolani, Vija, and Gwanda. So Kolani and Vija are caregivers at the initiation schools, whilst Gwanda is an initiate under the care of Kolani. So the film suggests that every year Kolani and Vija use the time and the space of Ulwalugo to have homosexual relations. So in their queer relationship, Vija's masculinity dominates that of Kolani. The film presents three sex scenes between the two characters, and the first two of these scenes unwittingly fall into the phallocentric scripting of the sexual act, in which there is a focus on power and domination, and an inordinate emphasis is placed on what Duplessis terms the limiting focus on penile erections and penetrations. The third scene, however, gestures towards a breakaway from the heteronormative scripting of gay sex. Kolani and Vija are at a waterfall, and they're framed as two vulnerable naked bodies. So focus is displaced from the phallus to the sensual pleasures that their bodies derive from each other. The scene indicates that it is possible to imagine gay sex without necessarily evoking phallocentric and heteropatriarchal vocabularies and grammars that thrive on binary conceptualizations of any relationship between two bodies. By unsettling the heteropatriarchal economies of affectivity, desire, and sexuality, this particular scene in the film invests validity and legitimacy on gay sex and establishes new expressive grammars of sex and sexuality. I quickly move on to the third film, which is called Hell and High Water, and it was released in 2016. So this Nollywood film tells the story of a young pastor called Laban, who is trapped in a loveless marriage. His male lover, she are married in order to satisfy the social expectations of men their age. So in one scene where the two men spend an intimate moment together, Kelechi states, and I quote him, "We can't keep doing this, stealing kisses and hiding." To which his pastor lover replies, "What would you rather do? This is Nigeria, not San Francisco." The scene highlights how queer individuals negotiate spaces in order to fit into heteropatriarchal societies, whilst clandestinely satisfying their sexual desires. So although this film tries to remain very objective in its depiction of queer protagonists, it unfortunately reproduces stereotypes about non-normative sexualities that are replete in Nollywood films. For instance, queer sexuality is framed as a sinful sin or a sinful lust, which goes against religious norms. Another view is that being gay is a choice that an individual makes, and that this choice can be changed at any given time. So Nollywood films grapple with how censorship is central in creating very formulaic kinds of filmic representations of queer characters and their experiences. The formulaic representations mark, however, a very pivotal step in making visible sexualities, experiences, and identities which have previously been obfuscated from public imagination and discussion. And the last film that I'm going to look at is Rafiki, released in 2018. The filmmaker Wanuri Kahui defines her art form as, and I quote her, fun, fierce, frivolous, as frivolous as bubblegum, Afro bubblegum. She explains that Afro bubblegum as an artistic movement and vision enables the imagining of vibrant stories about Africa and its inhabitants. Rafiki focuses on space making as a site of challenging heteronormativity. In several crucial scenes in the film. We see the protagonists, Kina and Ziki, occupying spaces as their relationship blossoms. Most of the explicitly intimate moments take place within an old Volkswagen camper. The camper allows Kina and Ziki to experience the erotic and sensuous potentialities of their bodies. Within the camper, what seems important to them are their bodies and the kinds of pleasures that they can experience. In one of their escapades, the camera zooms in on their body parts. We see their hands rubbing against each other, their thighs caressing, and their lips kissing. Rafiki offers a very progressive and radical vision of imagining not just same-sex desiring women, but African queers in general. It is precisely the way in which Rafiki looks beyond what appears to be a very cruel present and projects a future which is as vibrant as the colorful visual experience that Rafiki is, that this film draws its uniqueness and strength. So having quickly looked at these 4 films, I asked the question, what do these films do? So to begin with, these contemporary queer-themed films grapple with giving authentic representation of what it means to be queer in Africa, and also what it means to be queer and African in Africa. In North African films, like The Salvation Army, queerness is portrayed in very discreet and muted ways. In North African films, queerness is not articulated by what is shown on the screens, but rather by what remains unrepresented, what remains unsaid, and what remains not visualized. In Nollywood films, queer bodies are often cast as requiring some sort of salvation because they're viewed as deviant and straying from what religious dogma and cultural practices consider to be the correct bodily deployment and appropriate sexual expression. So nonetheless, recent films, especially those from sub-Saharan Africa, have been more daring in their portrayals of queerness. Films like Carmen Gay, Schoonheid, Canary, Ineba, Morphe, Rafiki, or While You Went Looking, have shown the vast possibilities that African films can achieve and surpass in representing queerness. In addition to having queer main characters, these films have marked an important departure from the previously moralizing discourses that have been embedded in queer film, representing of the subtle changes, the continuities and discontinuities in how queerness is and has been represented in African films. These different depictions dialogue with one another across spaces, across times, across cultures, and also across linguistic differences. Such conversations are essential in developing archives of queerness on the continent. So the growing body of queer-themed films interrogates colonial and heteropatriarchal archives whose invocation of African queerness has often been based on pathologizing and medicalizing epistemologies. So let me point out in conclusion that more and more films are being produced that screen African queerness in its diversity. Contemporary films have been focusing more on queer intimacy and pleasure. Lindsay Green's Scenes and Zetwell, in 2021, rightly explain that such a focus gestures towards the intimate pleasure and desire in African film cultures, in how the intimate pleasure, desire in African film cultures can inspire, transform, and empower. Thank you very much.
Sorry, fabulous, Gibson, thank you. Okay, straight on to Jameel.
All right. So when I was thinking about what to put together for this event, I thought to myself, oh goodness, what if we end up saying almost like the same thing? And then listening to that, I was like, oh, actually, no. I think what my contribution would do is give sort of less, so it's not an academic presentation, but give more of a view to thinking about why everything that Gibson said was important and is important. And so I decided to just sort of almost like stream of consciousness my thoughts around the idea of representation and self-writing. So thank you for inviting me to partake in this discussion. So I'd like to start with words from the epilogue of my book, Khamr, the Makings of Waterslams, where I said, how we choose to write ourselves into existence has implications for the stories we leave behind. The appetite for our raw trauma, uncensored, is big through the various gazes we are subjected to. It is an act of righteous sabotage against the power of the gaze to contextualize trauma in relation to that very power. When we tell our stories, we must make sure to remind ourselves of where it all started. When we talk about our afflictions, we must show how they came to be. This is not a way of escaping accountability for our own actions, but of naming power in all its forms. So I have been quietly reflecting on my own relationship with representation, memory, and identification. And I'm always drawn back to Nira Yuval Davis's work on identity and belonging. And I have questions such as, what does it mean to have an identity, and how does one do identity in a context that is so often hostile to difference? What is the point of having oneself represented and identified in the world? Does it matter? It absolutely does. So Yuval Davis says that identities are narratives, stories people tell themselves and others about who they are and who they are not. Not all of these stories are about belonging to particular groupings and collectivities. They can be, for instance, about individual attributes, body images, vocational aspirations, or sexual prowess. However, even such stories often relate directly or indirectly to self and or others' perception of what being a member in such a grouping or collectivity, ethnic, racial, national, cultural, religious, might mean. The identity narratives can be individual or they can be collective, the latter often a resource for the former. Although they can be reproduced from generation to generation, this reproduction is always carried out in a selective way. The identity narratives can shift and change, be contested and multiple. They can relate to the past, to a myth of origin. They can be aimed at explaining the present, and probably above all, they function as a projection of a future trajectory. Constructions of belonging, however, cannot and should not be seen as merely cognitive stories. They reflect emotional investments and desire for attachments. Individuals and groups are caught within wanting to belong, wanting to become, a process that is fueled by yearning rather than positing of identity as a stable state. Elspeth Probyn, as well as Anne-Marie Fortier, construct identity as transition, always producing itself through the combined processes of being and becoming, belonging and longing to belong. This duality is often reflected in narratives of identity. To bring it to the present moment, I've seen with alarm the recent attempts by the Vice-Chancellor of UCT to construct conversations about queer, trans, and intersex people. Of course, in an attempt to educate people about us without giving us an opportunity to speak. I mention this as a way to demonstrate the harm of exclusion from self-representation in two ways. the unqualified construction of identity, and the loss of belonging. As I've said, identities are the stories we tell ourselves and others about who we are and who we are not. They are not stories that others tell about us. This was the basis of the instruction, "Nothing about us without us," handed to us by disability activists Michael Masuta and William Rowland in the 1990s. Although we know the origins of this sentiment existed long before. It is because we know individually and in consultation with each other who we have been and who we are and who we want to become that we are best placed to articulate it. With a view of all our social locations and their consequences, we know what kind of society we would like to belong to. The process of being and becoming, belonging and longing to belong, is not one that can be directed from the outside. It is simple. Because we have suffered the effects of exclusion and erasure, we know that the justifications for such treatment are based on fallacies constructed about us in the interests of power. The same power cannot possibly be best placed to represent us. Inclusion and representation is also not simply about having more bodies in the room or difficult names on the covers of books. It is the opportunity to undo stereotypes and token narratives. We sometimes will not agree on what the outcome should be, but objectively, anything with the potential to cause more harm cannot be the end goal, no matter what the payoff is. We are, after all, often incentivized to self-mutilate in this way. So what do we say when we do speak? We are silenced and erased as a collective. We must speak in the interests of the collective always. I say very intentionally the interests of the collective, not on behalf of the collective. Though we may not know what each member of the collective needs, we do know what they don't need. When given the opportunity to speak and represent ourselves, we are always at risk of being seduced by individualism. To be the first and the only comes with hollow praise, because what have we really achieved in the name of equality when we assimilate into elite spaces at the expense of millions of others like us? We do not speak to be heard as individuals. Representation and belonging is a group project. If the goal is to be heard, seen, and represented, we cannot rely on the dominant means of cultural production. As communities, we have opportunities through collective care to create our own spaces for expression and representation. We must create space to dream beyond the trappings of the world we currently live in. We must dream realities that are not yet here. I am reminded of the words of Mona Al-Tahawi in the foreword of Khamr, which read, "It is radical to say I count in a world that constantly reminds you of your worthlessness. It is subversive to look at the systems of oppression that prop up that world and to insist, I am here. And when, to terrify you into silence, the ultimate counter-revolutionary cudgel, what will people say, is dragged out, it is revolutionary to say, I don't give a fuck. This is my story and everyone will hear it." At the heart of representation and the opportunity to write ourselves into existence is this statement, I count. I have learned to seek out people like me if I am to survive the toll a marginalized existence takes on one's mental health. Begging to be accepted in normative spaces is one of the most damaging things we can do to ourselves. We must also seek out the people who affirm our realities and retreat into self-indulgence when necessary. It is important to occupy spaces where we don't have to constantly explain and justify our experiences. I would like to end by simply saying that however we choose to write ourselves into the archive of history, I hope it is with the intention of disrupting the official script in which we are misrepresented and in the interests of freedom for all. Those who come after us should be able to build on what we left behind, proud to read our efforts not only at disrupting, but simply being. I would now like to read a poem by Koleka Putuma out of her latest collection, Hello, Bye-bye, Coco, Come In, that I think captures everything I said wonderfully and perhaps covers some things I have not said. And in the interest of representation, this is the book. You may go out and find it, purchase it, and enjoy it. The poem goes, let us count the ways. Your publisher is owed money by distributors who are owed money by bookstores that mount books about America and its presidents in their storefront displays instead of books by African authors. When you ask the cashier if they have stocks of your book, she leads you to the only copy left, squeezed and lost between cookbooks and self-help books. At the panel discussion, the moderator asks how it feels to be a bestseller. You ramble about gratitude, the integration of imagination and the cost of books in this country. You are too ashamed to also mention there have been times you could not afford your own book. That it has taken you not fully owning your story to know the cost of your story. Let us count the ways. Institution appoints Black women in coveted position. Institution appoints Black women as the first. Spectators raise their pom-poms and vuvuzelas as Black women inherits an institution submerged in corruption. Being the first has Black women afraid of breathing out of key. Not in that room, not in that seat, with people attaching their oxygen to hers. Black woman spends the next years of her tenure dousing scandals and debt with damage control, keeping audits and the board at bay. While being undermined by male counterparts, while being the mannequin of representation, so Black girls can see themselves represented. So Black girls can inherit less foul institutions that rely on Black women being resilient, because they are. The first, when dismissed for mismanagement, the institution will hold a public jury to validate why institutions should not appoint Black women who cannot be co-opted or programmed. Black women who cannot play nice or get on quietly. Thank you.
Wow, I mean, I just love how the poem actually also orients our attention to questions of political economy, right? Like who produces the books, who produces the cultural materials that we're kind of talking about. Anyway, brilliant, thank you so much. Okay, I'm sure our discussant Dee has a lot of things to throw at us. So Dee, over to you, and then we'll open up to our audience. Amazing interventions, both of you. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much to Gibson and to Jamil for those incredibly provocative presentations. I must admit that the rather unfortunate part of my role is that I don't get to just kind of enjoy the listening. I'm just frantically taking notes, and and I hope that in the little bit of time that I have today that I'm able to kind of pull things together a little bit. Thank you both. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Sheila, for the invitation to this really wonderful panel. So, where to start? There's actually so much to say. I'm going to start with a little excerpt from Tina Camp's Listening to Images and Exercising Counterintuition. And it's the very beginning of the book. And she, you know, Tina Camp's work, I'm quite taken with this work at the moment because of how she speaks about images talking beyond what we see, that in their photographic composition often in the in the family portrait, there's a lot that one does not see or hear, and she's speaking about African American families historically, kind of trying to trace and map kind of moments of belonging for African American folk at a particular time. And she builds very much on this idea of the sonic, the image that talks back to us, right? Whether we and kind of alerts us to being open to hearing what the image has to say. And so even though, Jamil, you're not speaking about images, you're speaking about a kind of a much larger archive of belonging and identity, and you're questioning how that works. And Gibson, you are speaking about an archive, you're speaking about a growing archive. It's not a direct relationship, but there's something here that I think works. And I just want to quote very briefly. So she speaks about this introduction as a kind of throat clearing gesture. And she asks a series of questions about the African diaspora and through this notion of imaging and portraiture. My own space-making gesture, she writes, ruminates on two central questions. How do we build a radical visual archive of the African diaspora that grapples with the recalcitrant and the disaffected, the unruly and the dispossessed? Secondly, through what modalities of perception, encounter, and engagement do we constitute it? These questions induce a volley of corollary questions. What is the place in this archive for images assumed only to register forms of institutional accounting or state management? How do we contend with images intended not to figure Black subjects, but to delineate instead differential or degraded forms of personhood or subjection? Images produced for the purpose of tracking, cataloging, constraining the movements of Blacks. She speaks about in and out of the diaspora, and I'm thinking about queer bodies. And of course, we're not speaking about the diaspora. Neither of you are really, although it is always invoked in conversations such as these. And so I think we know that we're speaking about much larger terrain. But the things that came up for me that register across Khamr's work and what both of you have presented today on notions of the quotidian, notions of expression and representation, and what Khamr asks, what is this relationship between quiet and the quotidian? And I thought, Jameel, you raised this notion of the quiet and the everyday. I felt that come out quite strongly. And that there's so much that is unsaid and unspoken, but is layered and is there, right? And I think interestingly that when you started, you said you realized that you were kind of speaking to why what Gibson was presenting us with mattered. And I think that you did that in a very kind of profound way. And so in particular, so the kind of intersecting themes that came up for me were silence, the relationship between silence and the building of the archive, and the presence of hearing even when there is no actual sound. And that even in not seeing an archive, I mean, Jameel, you're speaking about, you're using different textures, right? You're using poetry, you're referencing your own book, and of course your own narrative and your own memory project. There's a kind of intimacy that you are inviting us into in thinking about how you self-represent, but also in how queer self-representation works and functions, and also what some of the kind of fractured moments, and there are many, what those are. I think you've brought some of those to light for us. And thus brought to bear a kind of building on this, or building of a lexicon of futurity, right, in this fragility. And I think that is crucial for me in what you've said. That in all the memory work, and I love memory work, I love the ability that, I love the kind of gift that memory work brings, which is that you get this glimpse into someone's world, not in an ethnographic way, but in a way where you're sharing parts of yourself, right? Yet my question with memory work always comes back to what does this help us achieve collectively? And I think that this was the other thing that you really brought up for me, was there's a kind of personal sense of identity and belonging, and there's a collective sense of identity and belonging. Those two do not always work together, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and both are messy and complicated and do feel like a stream of consciousness depending on where you land and how you land there. And so, okay, so I want to just turn to Gibson's presentation on the 4 films. And there's so much to say here, Gibson. In your longer paper, you also, I know you briefly referenced it now, you reference a number of other films, Kanari and Morphe, some of the more recent kind of representations of queer relationships in cinema or in African cinema. And one of the things that really came up for me was how these films, so many of them, yes, absolutely, I agree with you 100%. There's been significant growth and development in representations of queer identities in film, right? In cinema, in African representations of queer relationships. And I think that of course is fraught and complex, because each nation has its own set of kind of cultural assumptions. That said, I do understand what you mean, because you're speaking about African cinema as a whole. But I think that there's something very interesting about, and you note this, about how these representations of these kind of clandestine acts are still very much the focal point of many of these so-called queer films, and that the genre queer cinema, or kind of overarching umbrella title or term, that yes, there have been developments that have been made, but there's a lot that's lost. There's a lot of the kind of texture to people that I still do not see in these films and that I question. And I've not seen all of the films you mentioned, Gibson, but I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, so thinking about a film like Morphe, and thinking about a film like it's gone now, but they're both about a queer man who's in the army. Sorry, my apologies. A queer man who's in the army and then, comes out as gay, and how that kind of gets pitted, this kind of hyper masculine character, this queer character who cannot come out, or who does come out, but who is scared to do so. And so there's this kind of binary that is reinscribed, which I think poses an interesting set of questions, but I always leave these films wondering, what does this say about a queer collective? Like, I'm not sure that there's really, it still feels largely voyeuristic, many of these films. And I think that is problematic. I know that Rafiki was very well received, and I think a very interesting film, and it made me think a lot of the special issue, which you'll remember, Shrela, from feminist theory, Chiclet, the one called Chiclets in a Time of African Cosmopolitanism. And so many, some of the films that you reference, Gibson, have that kind of feel about them, where they are accessible. There are interesting things going on in them, of course there are, but you know, there's also a lot that's kind of more complex, of course. And then you look at the genre for what the genre is and what it offers audiences, and you realize there is definitely a more kind of critical element to the film, but also to one's reading of that film or of the series of films. Okay, sorry, I'm just seeing. So, I'm not sure that I've done much by way of pulling together anything, other than to just note some of the things that I found very interesting, and some of the, some of what I mean, points that I think that we can all leave with and think about a little bit more. The last thing I want to note, and I think that this is definitely an overlap, is you're both speaking about forms of intimacy with ourselves, and intimacy with partners, and intimacies in how we are represented to others. And I think that that is really interesting, and I think quite generative. And I think, I would love to hear more. Jamil, I'd love to hear more about the book, which, I mean, I've read about so much and have not yet picked up, but I actually grew up down the road in Belleville South, and so much of what you say was very fascinating and familiar to me. And and I guess I want to hear a little bit more about how you both think about this notion of queer intimacy as collective, right? Which I think you both kind of touch on, but I think Gibson, I'd also love to hear more about how you think the films do work. How do they kind of progress or instigate, even if not progress, a conversation, a dialogue that is not only inclusive and not moralistic, but also kind of critical, right? That doesn't only think about or doesn't only kind of position how these films, do they or do they not kind of position themselves in line with what is palatable or mildly provocative to a kind of heteronormative audience. That's where I always get stuck with these kinds of films. And what makes these African queer films different from other queer films? I think I'll leave it there, and I'd love to just hear more from both of you.
Okay, do you want to say something? Thank you, T. Thank you. I think you packed in way more than you think you did. So do you both want to quickly respond? Because I know there's some questions and I don't want to lose the opportunity for both of you to respond to those questions. Maybe just some quick responses to D, and then Kayo, if you're happy to I think there are at least 4 questions that I can see. Who would like to go? Jameel?
All right. I was talking to a friend the other day about, we were having a conversation, and through the conversation, in an extremely unexpected way, the person that she was talking about, I know them quite well. Now, this friend and I have been friends for 13 years. And the person that she was talking about, who she had recently met, I had also recently met, but the two of us didn't know that we knew this person at the same time. And so it was just so funny that you say that you grew up down the road, and I've been in your presence a few times. I have seen your work. I've also been in the School of Arts. I think, you had an office there at some point. And it's just, it's so interesting to me, this idea of 7 degrees of separation. So, listening to what you proposed, talking about queer intimacy in a collective, if I think about in terms of, in the context of how I wrote about it in the book, and from a retrospective perspective. it's an interesting one, because I think what in that time for me was made me belong to a collective was the curtailment of intimacy. And so I write that, you know, it wasn't so much that one knew what you wanted to, what you aspired to. Everything that you knew was defined by what you didn't want and what shouldn't have happened. And I think at that time, and I talk about, you know, as a teenager, for example, looking around and seeing my peers having their first love affairs and having it fall apart, and having their parents and their siblings actually there in like daytime to comfort them through it. And it's not an anomaly. It's not something that shouldn't have happened. And so in contrast, sort of being excluded and barred from that experience is something that is the only thing that I could share with other people like me at the time, you know. But now you see, I mean, now I think what that has done in terms of introducing the idea of intimacy in the queer sense to the collectives that I now belong to. I think many of us have become extremely intentional about creating opportunities for sharing that intimacy, and that, you know, it's like it's the result of not being able to do that for so long. So now there's, and you know, now there's I think about how 10 years ago there would just be certain ways of speaking that I wouldn't participate in, even in the company of fellow queer people, because it's just not something that you were socialized into. And now there's this thing of speaking about different ways of intimacy, like becoming safe spaces for each other, in terms of just in some ways vomiting out your experience of the world and knowing that it will be received not with disdain or confusion, but affirmation. And even sexual intimacy, speaking about sex, not as that other kind of sex, but sex as the sex, you know, in those spaces, and not only in queer spaces, but just in general. I think it's become a really subversive, but also disruptive practice in the ways in which I think we want to normalize the idea of intimacy amongst queer people and in relation to others.
Gibson?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dee, for your questions and for your provocations. I think to think through them, I'll also ask a series of questions on queer African filmic representation. For example, you rightly point out that representation is a very messy affair. So how can films offer very authentic representation of African queerness without being very voyeuristic at the same time? And whose gaze is normally shown through these films? And why is it that as more and more films are produced that are queer themed, why do particular themes like the clandestine continue to be reproduced in these very contemporary kinds of films? So I think you're very interesting provocations in relation to how films, or the kind of work that films should be doing in undoing very normative kinds of representations of what queer bodies are, what queer experiences are, and what they should be and should be doing as well.
Okay, thank you, Gibson. Shall we go straight to the questions, Kyle?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, the panel, the speakers, and Dee, for such a compelling, really set of thoughts. We have very interesting questions from the audience, and I think I'll combine a couple of them, and then we can go back to the speakers. So there are a few questions about queer representation in film, and one of them has to do, Gibson, what does this queering of film actually do to filmmaking? So for instance, in terms of cinematography techniques, if that is something that you have been looking at. Are queer films just films with queer characters, or there's something else going on in terms of aesthetics and techniques? I guess that's the point of the question. Another question also about representation in film has to do with the example of South Africa, and the person is saying that after Intseba was released, there was this wave of backlash, right? Homophobia and cultural chauvinism in reaction to the film. And I guess that resonates with a few other of your examples as well. For instance, Rafiki, that has been banned in Kenya. So I guess the question would be, how do we understand this flourishing African queer cinema in relation to these kinds of political backlash and even censorship in some cases? And then the question is, how are these related to the wider debate on what does it mean to be queer in Africa? The third question also for Gibson is about your point about queerness in African film being about what is unseen, what is unsaid. And then the question is about, it asks you to speak a little bit more about this particular type of characters, which are arguably queer without being expressly so. So characters that could be queer, but if they are not on camera. They are outside the frame, outside the film. And how do we, and I think also thinking about this question, I think it raises very interesting theoretical issues regarding visibility and invisibility in film. What can actually be visible and in what terms? And then there is a question to Jamil, which is very interesting and very complex, which speaks about belonging. And I think that will tie very nicely to your reply to these comments, which is about so it asks us to kind of complicate a little bit our relationship to belonging by asking, what about stretching the construction of belonging to include also what is outside belonging? So disrupting this kinds of aspirational futures to belong, but thinking instead about perhaps not belonging, and or what are the alternative framings to belonging? And I think that that's a very interesting question. And then a last question to Jamil as well, regarding the invisibilization of queer bodies in some areas and their misrepresentation in some forums. And the person is giving an example of what has happened at UCT very recently. So how do we think about these harmful acts in spaces that are supposed to be more sensitive about queer inclusion? And I guess we can speak both of the space of the university, but also the space of cultural production, either in publishing or in cinema. So I think those are all very interesting and complex questions. You don't have to feel obliged to address all the points, but if you can give us an overview of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kayo. I'll try and speak to the three questions that you've asked. The first one on what queer cinema looks like. And as you rightly point out, it's definitely more than just the themes being represented in the films or having queer characters in films. The films themselves are also doing a lot other stuff technically. If you look, for example, at North African films, where technically you have very little sound. There's no extra sound that is added post-production, for example. So what you have are very minimalist sounding within the film, which leaves us with just the bodies themselves on the screen, the bodies talking to each other. So this is one very striking technique in North African cinema, and also the way in which these films focus on the skin as an expressive, screen through which to read queerness. So there's a lot that is happening technically as well in the films. Or if you look at a film like Rafiki, where you have so much color within the frames that the film presents, all, I think, speaking to this vision that the filmmaker is trying to portray of queerness in Africa, in Kenya in this case. So more than just the thematics, aesthetically, the films are also doing so much more. And then the question of what remains unsaid or what remains unrepresented in the film is also very interesting. As I've pointed out, this is especially in the films from North Africa, where you have a combination of culture and religion, Islam working together to silence in a way queerness. So all the queerness is not presented on the screen, but rather it's suggested, it's hinted. It's something that happens outside the frame of the screen. And as I've pointed out, I think in a previous paper, this is a very interesting technique of trying to counter the kinds of silences that you find in Arab Muslim societies concerning queerness, where people don't identify as queer or gay or lesbian, where there is no identity. There is no queer identity. Everything is just reduced to actions. So one does queer sex, and one is not queer. I don't know if that even makes sense. And then if I can try to talk to the last question on the kinds of reactions that these films have elicited, and how they speak to censorship and the politics and the homophobia in Africa. It's very interesting, for example, in the case of Ingleba, that the reactions were mainly based on what people had heard about the film. Because, for example, on the first day of the screening, there were already demonstrations from people who had obviously not watched the films, who found that the film was not palatable to South African audiences. And funny enough, at the same time, there was the screening of one of the 50 Shades of Grey films, which I think is, in terms of being palatable, is not as palatable as Ingleba, in the way, for example, that Ingleba was considered very, very pornographic, for example. I think that's what the film and that's what was said when the film was banned, that it was too hardcore to be shown in public cinemas. So I think these films, Rafiki as well, try to speak to this kind of chauvinism and homophobia, which continue to to be displayed or to be found in African countries. And I think the more films are daring in offering very authentic kinds of images of African queerness, I think then these films will also do more in countering and challenging homophobia and also the kinds of censorship that we see facing some of the filmic representations in Africa. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the question by Susan. So I think there are multiple interesting points to jump from. So the first is, do we always long to belong? I mean, not necessarily always. But I think an important part of what both Yuval Davis and Probert said was that there's duality, there's process. It's not a thing that we've arrived at or that we ever do. I actually just want to get exactly, so, you know, the identity narratives can shift and change, be contested and multiple. So this question itself is exactly that, contestation. The question itself is calling for something more, multiple. So I think that, so on following on from that, Susan says, what about if we do not like the options we have available to belong to? I think that speaks to, you know, what I said later on, which was creating spaces, which was not begging to be accepted in spaces, in normative spaces that just won't accept. And I think there really is value in going out. And I do understand that it is easier said than done. You know, we talk about agency all the time as an abstraction, but the truth is there really are some of us who have been so dispossessed of that even the choices we have to make are choiceless choices. And so with that, you know, acknowledging that, I still want to say that where we do have those opportunities to create a new and to create something else, perhaps those are the things we can look at when the options we have are not to our liking. What happens if we have to keep stretching constructions of belonging to include constructions of outside belonging? So I think the nice thing was that belonging itself was not so rigidly defined. And so I do think that when we question the idea of belonging and what we want to belong to and what we don't want to belong to, if at all we want to belong to, I think those are open-ended. There's an opportunity to decide still, or I'd like to think there is, and indeed we do that. We sometimes say, you know, all of these things that are currently available to me, I don't like it, and I want to do something else, you know. Some people choose to form community with animals because they don't like humans very much. However, there is a sense of belonging that comes from that. You know, I feel comfortable here. I like spending time with my dog. My dog understands me. Therefore, I belong here. So should we be using belonging as something to aspire to? What are some alternative frames? Look, I think that I can't speak on behalf of, you know, everybody in the world. But if I think about my own life and my own sort of emotional and intellectual trajectory, I do think that in some form or another, my social, you know, interactions and actions have been directed by trying to find a place where I feel like, yeah, I like it here. You know, this is where I'm supposed to be with people like me. So I don't know if it's something we should be using, you know, as something to aspire to, but I think it holds value. I think it's a very valid aspiration to have. Some of the alternative framings, I think that's too soon a question to ask me after having presented that, but certainly something to think about. I do think, I don't know, maybe community is another way of thinking about it, and that is something that you can in and out, you can go in and out of, you know. And so sometimes when you don't wanna, it's okay, you know, take a break and then come back when you're ready. So I hope that does in some way give a response. And then Sean asked about the invisibilization of queer bodies in some areas, especially when perpetrated by people who are supposed to be more informed and sensitive to such matters. Look, I mean, you know, that statement, supposed to be more informed and sensitive, is an interesting one, because who set that precedent? And did the person agree to display those characteristics, or to fulfill that agreement of being, you know, informed and sensitive? I think what was the very specific example of what happened at UCT, I think that the response to that is already a great example of what could be done. And it might not always, you know, yield fantastic results, but I think when we're talking about power and people, you know, resourced people who choose to engage in such acts of misrepresentation, despite contestations. And, you know, I had a conversation recently on I think it was Power. I was being asked about this idea of cancel culture, and it's a very hot topic everywhere. And I mean, the first thing is that for me, cancel culture is actually, it's a colloquialization of accountability. And that is something that is inscribed and built into the fabric of all, you know, institutions and constitutions that exist in our country. So that in itself is not a new concept. But I mentioned that when somebody has done something egregious, often the first port of call for people who find themselves aggrieved is to reach out in the spirit of education and community and humanity and say, hey, you know, this thing that you did, it wasn't the best thing to do. These are the consequences. This is how it hurt people. I think you should be aware of this. That is first and foremost an opportunity to self-correct. What often happens, because people are in such powerful positions and cannot be faced with the consequences of their actions, much less also just an apology, people just, they often continue, or they double down, or they basically just say, no, I don't care what you have to say. And then from there, the response is cancel this person, take away their job, take away this, take away that, punishment. But the point is that there are so many opportunities along the way to correct, you know. And so I don't think that the approach to harm, perpetual sort of coddling and docility and all of those things, I'm personally not the kind of person, for those who follow the things I do in the world, I'm personally not the person who turns the other cheek, as it is said. And I've never also professed to be nonviolent. I don't believe that, you know, one must meet violence with gentility. I don't believe in that. But so I think that what happened in that instance and the response to that is how we must deal with these things. We must invoke the instruments of accountability that we have at our disposal. In addition to that, because those are also not ever, foolproof sort of avenues for retribution. The courts in our country, we know, are not the, pristine, perfect instruments of retribution that we think they are. The bodies that we have set up in these colonial institutions that are the universities themselves are set up in the interests of protecting power. So aside from that, what we must do, which I mentioned, was where we have the resources and the expertise, we must create those spaces anew. We must install the people that we believe are of value and that will actually do the job that we hope such a space initially would have done, and continue doing the work. We have the tools at our disposal. We have the resources then also to bring others in, and platform those people. And so I think, the only thing that we really can do is continuously set the record straight, not specifically with the intention of, knocking whoever it is that did what they did off their throne, but simply for our own benefit and for the benefit of those who are there to learn and just so happen to find themselves in the right space at that time to learn it.
Yeah, but also, isn't it ironic, because nobody ever does get deposed of their throne. So actually this whole, panic around cancel culture really overestimates its impact, which is that nobody in power actually loses power.
Exactly.
Right? It's just those who are injured are trying to make, alternative spaces of accountability, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's still very much fixed positions about who is still injured and, anyway. So, no, thank you for bringing that in. Kayud, I know I'm a little conscious of the time, but I think we've done well with the questions, have we? I just wanted to give Dee the opportunity to maybe say something as a last final thought. And just to say, Dee, I thought your provocations really hone our attention into how, queerness is a world-making project, right? And I think what Gibson was suggesting is that these films do that. And I like the way, as the critique in the room, perhaps for you to say, well, does it? Or what is the limits of that? But I also think the question by Susan around belonging was also a question, I think, to ask about the bounds or the limits of world making, right? And also around whether, in its essence, queerness has been anti-normative, right? So then, what does that, how does that then recast the question of belonging? I think it's just really interesting. So Dee, any just final thoughts? And, we've gone over by 20 minutes, but we'll wrap up soon.
Not really. I actually missed out on part of the discussion because I think my internet connection went a bit wonky and I disappeared, and not for very long, but I think I missed a little bit. But no, I think this conversation has really kind of evolved in such an interesting way. And I was just listening to both of you, Gibson and Jamil, and I was thinking about how the notion of silence it came up so strongly also in Gibson speaking, and you spoke a little bit more in the when you were answering some of the questions, Gibson, around how the representations of these characters in the film, there's a lot that is not said and there's a lot that is not shown, right? But that there is this kind of the unsaid, the unseen, the kind of aesthetic, the qualities that are there but not necessarily pictured, that really contributes to something that is quite interesting in kind of furthering how we think about self-representation and queer representation in general. And I'm not convinced that some of the films that we're speaking about here today are deeply invested in critical self-representation. But I think that there is a kind of investment in thinking about queer representation in general, where the line is between pop culture and the kind, and that's why I brought up that thing around Chiclets. There is something that is interesting there that always kind of teeters a little bit on being interesting, critically interesting and contributive in a more generative fashion that goes beyond just a pop culture standard rom-com. Yeah, there's always a fine line, right? And I also think interesting, Gibson, which you were speaking about again in the answer when you were answering one of the questions, was around the distinction between North African film and some of the Southern African films that you're using, right? And so certainly in the example of Ingleba, for example, and Morphe, which you mentioned, and then two other films that I was thinking about. The name I couldn't get to was From Sando to Samantha, and Kanari. In all three of those films, this hyper masculine army theme, that's what I was trying to get at earlier. It is so, it's just so interesting to me that those two things get pitted against each other, this kind of fragile, vulnerable, queer character in the face of this big institutional army thing, of course also backed by a kind of the apartheid context in which they're all set in, right? And so yeah, so there's something quite interesting there. And I also thought, Gibson, that that there are many things to say about each context or from each context. So the North African filmic representations versus or in relation to or in conversation with some of the films that you're speaking about from a more from a different African context. Yeah, and then thank you also, Jamil, for kind of furthering this conversation around community. And I also thought that the thing that you almost touched on, but not quite, was this notion of care, right? Care and care. Shirley, I don't know if you heard me. Sorry, I thought it's like kind of wincing a little. But yeah, I feel like it's kind of layered under the surface, both in the both in the
Is it just me or did we lose Dee?
I think we lost
you. As you spoke. Can you hear me?
We
sorry.
lost you. You're back. You're back.
Good. Okay. I was just saying listening to you again now. The concept of care comes through quite strongly, and that earlier I was saying, belonging, identity. I see how they all kind of work together in a kind of critical queer self-representation, which I think you're speaking about in your personal context, but also in a larger collective context. I think that those elements woven together, the missing thing for me in hearing you speak is care, because I think that there is such a strong element of that, even alongside or even juxtapositioned against this notion of cancel culture, right? And so, yeah, so there's some really interesting stuff there too. I'll stop now, otherwise I'll just keep going.
Yeah, and actually I think we very much abuse our audience's time, because we're like an hour and then we're just like, oh, okay, it's an hour and a half or maybe even two. But I think that's testament always to, the rich conversations, the unexpected. I think you put it really nicely, like where the conversation has now got us to cancel culture and care. And I love it. I think it's just, they're just so rich, and it always leaves, I think, Kayo and me with, a lot to think about. So thank you so much to all three of you. Gibson, I hope you're still hanging on there, electricity notwithstanding. Totally Yeah, I'm sure you are. But yeah, thank you so much. I mean, you know, Gibson still being here is testament to the fact that these are not normal conditions. So it's really hard for all of us to do this kind of work, and we are so appreciative. So just to our audience as well, of course, thank you for sticking on, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. We're back on in 2 weeks' time, so I think that's the 29th, okay? And yeah, just keep looking. We'll share publicity soon, and I hope some of you can join. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.